Hi, fellow seekers. This is a short, I hope, and lighthearted, I hope, video on a topic of admittedly no import whatsoever except to myself. Perhaps I might win you over to my side. It concerns a number of decisions, mostly in the last few decades, vis-à-vis the assorted appellations we have chosen to bestow upon the multifarious celestial objects within our galaxy. I don't know what, or even precisely when it happened, but sometime in the previous century, the collective endeavor that we loosely term science managed to mislay its eloquence. Say what you like about the alchemists, but their ear for poetry was unequaled. What we call antimony trioxide, they called flowers of antimony. What we call nitric acid, they called aqua fortis. What we call lead oxide, they called Paris yellow. And in a personal favorite, what we call antimonious oxychloride, they called powder of Algaroth. Not that I have anything against those modern signifiers, mind you. They roll off the tongue easily enough and are eloquently descriptive of their nature. But then, they were coined by the inestimable Antoine Lavoisier, who got his head cut off for his trouble. Even his contemporaries in astronomy, bar one obvious exception which I will return to later, had the classical sensitivity to name the first four asteroids Ceres, Pallas, Juno, and Vesta. But these days, with a few notable exceptions like Mike Brown, that mythic impulse seems to be lacking, or at least on autopilot. And so, with all due love and respect for the esteemed minds who granted them, here are 10 names of celestial objects that I want changed. 10. Any mare on the moon's far side. I never know when to begin when talking about the moon. A surprising number of people aren't even aware it rises in daylight, so I never assume that anyone knows its most striking feature, that it only ever shows one face to our planet. I once heard tell of a Renaissance king who raged at an astronomer who refused to craft him a complete globe of the moon, apparently ignorant that it was only half visible to us pathetic Terrans. That seems puerile today, but at the time even asking for a globe would have been transgressive. Until the 17th century, the standard model of the moon, promoted by Aristotle, was that it was not a world at all, but a perfectly spherical, eternal entity, composed of divine ether. And then, in 1610, Galileo viewed the moon through his telescope for the first time, and, in a series of expert illustrations, revealed the moon for the cratered, blemished, imperfect world it was. A new land had been staring down at us since we could see. We just couldn't see it. But new lands bring explorers, and explorers bring names. Posterity has granted the onerous achievement of mapping and naming the moon's surface to 3 men: Michel Florent von Landren, Johannes Hevelius, and Giovanni Battista Riccioli. Von Landren was first. Scion of a family of cartographers, in 1645 he took his natal vocation into higher dimensions. His first detailed map of the moon was intended to aid navigation. A good Catholic, von Landren named the features he saw after Catholic saints and current royalty, and was the first to divide the moon into its great dark provinces, which he called Maria, or seas, and lighter surrounding areas, Terrae, or land. While certainly well-intentioned, his names for the Terrae in particular were uninspired, including such soporific titles as the Land of Justice, the Land of Honor, the Land of Dignity, and the Land of Peace. His decision to name the features after Catholic saints didn't travel well in the politico-religious mire that was Europe at the time, but the name Maria stuck. Next in line was Johannes Hevelius, though few of his names currently survive. He does have a crater on the moon named after him, though. The moon's true christener, who embraced this alien world in all its fantastical glory, was Giovanni Riccioli. I've mentioned him before in my video on Venus. He was the first to spot the still unidentified ashen light on Venus's dark side. An ordained Jesuit priest, Riccioli was, depending on your point of view, one of the last great pre-modern astronomers, or one of the first great modern ones. Though an avid fan of the telescope, he did not endorse Galileo's heliocentrism, which has led many historians to view him as a reactionary crank, which he was emphatically not. In fact, after disagreeing with Galileo's famous experiment with weights, he published a thorough, robust, and meticulous repetition of Galileo's experiment, and reluctantly concluded that he was correct. Personally, I don't begrudge the man his geocentrism, since at the time the discussion was still more philosophical than scientific. Riccioli was not of the vanguard, and that's fine. His legacy lies not with the earth or the sun, but with the moon, and in the vistas his mind's eye crafted for him as he attempted to comprehend its inscrutable, ineffable landscape. In 1651, Riccioli published Almagestum Novum, the New Almagest, a somewhat presumptuously named text that attempted to update Ptolemy's masterwork, the supreme astronomical compendium for the previous 1,000 years, for the age of the telescope. Although only the first third was completed, it became a standard reference text for over a century, employed by such pioneers as John Flamsteed and Jérôme Lalande. The work was primarily an update of Ptolemy's text, adding contemporary discoveries such as supernovae and early formulations of gravity. But it was his map of the moon that has stood the test of time. With no frame of reference for the literally otherworldly vistas before him, geology wasn't a science in his time, and impact craters wouldn't be recognized until the 20th century, Riccioli ditched inductive reasoning and simply let his imagination soar. In his mind, the cold grey wastes of the moon transformed into a heavenly garden of delights, the sea of nectar, the bay of dew, the bay of love, the sea of fecundity. Its great plains were transformed into raging unexplored waters, the ocean of storms, the sea of crises, the sea of foam, the sea of waves, and fantastical locations waiting to be visited, the lake of dreams, the swamp of decay, the lake of death, the sea of cold. Riccioli transmuted his own contemplation onto the world he was seeing, the sea of tranquility, the sea of serenity, the lake of solitude. The age of reason would of course reveal that the features Riccioli saw were not seas. The space age would reveal that they were, albeit of frozen lava rather than water. But the space age would also allow humanity to finally see behind the moon's face and glimpse its far side. The result could very well rank as the greatest anticlimax in human history. The far side of the moon was almost comically boring, a shaggy dog punchline to the story of human exploration. What few Maria there were tiny and degraded, with the rest of the surface an endless churn of impact craters. To this day, no one knows why this dichotomy exists, though it has been suggested that the near side possesses more radioactive elements, making it more readily volcanic. Piddling and anemic though they were, the seas of the far side still needed names, and so the heirs of Riccioli rode in to grant them linguistic immortality. I think the monotony of their discovery may have rubbed off on them. Their names included such gems of wit as the Sea of the Edge, because it was on the edge, the Southern Sea, because it was in the south, the Eastern Sea, ditto, and the Sea of Moscow. That wasn't even named after Moscow, by the way. It was named after Moscow Crater. And then there's my personal favorite, the now known sea. The now known sea? That roundly beats trans-Neptunian object for the most vapidly obvious descriptor in the cosmos. I do kind of like the Sea of Ingenuity. That makes sense, but why not follow up on the self-congratulation? The Sea of Intellect, the Sea of Inspiration, or even the Sea of Discovery. And while I get that the Soviet Union were the first to see the far side of the moon, if you're going to pay tribute to Russia, how about the Sea of Ice, or the Sea of Winter? In sum, just loosen the heck up, guys. 9. Dimidium. I conceived this video as a hysterical YouTube rant. Me spewing poetic wrath at the ill-conceived, awkward appellations bestowed by soulless number crunchers or thought-numbing committees. But then I did the research, and I learned that, however much I may disagree with some decisions, oftentimes there are valid reasons behind them. Nowhere is this truer than with that lump of verbal tofu, Dimidium, the name given to 51 Pegasi b, the first exoplanet found around a sun-like star. And that's no nickname, by the way. It's official. The universe is now home to a planet called Dimidium. I can't entirely blame the IAU for this. It was part of an appeal to the public in 2015 to name an assortment of recently discovered, historically speaking, celestial objects. To be fair, the competition wasn't exactly stiff, though I personally like the idea of a planet named Starry Bunnies. I'm usually a big believer in the wisdom of crowds. I edit Wikipedia, for God's sake, and most of the chosen names were perfectly fine. But this is 51 Pegasi b, the planet that launched the modern age of astronomy. Think of the planetary names conjured by degreeless writers, slaving over their keyboards. Vulcan, named for the god of the forge. Endor, named for a village in the Hebrew Bible. Arrakis, actually named for a star. And now we have Dimidium, named for half, because it's half the mass of Jupiter, along with dozens of other exoplanets. Not exactly a distinguishing signifier. Was there not an alternative that spoke to its unique character and place in history? In fact, there was, but thanks to the actions of one particularly odious individual, we can't use it. When Swiss astronomer Michel Mayor became the first person to detect an exoplanet around a sun-like star in 1995, he didn't believe it. The data suggested that the world he'd found, 51 Pegasi b, was a gas giant, but one that orbited its star in just 4 days. Planets were not supposed to behave that way. Not even the most outlandish science fiction writers had ever conceived of such a hellish world. Obviously, it would need confirmation, and so Mayor turned to his main competitor in the race to find the first exoplanet, American astronomer Geoffrey Marcy, who, I'm sure through clenched teeth, confirmed Mayor's discovery barely a week later. And then, Marcy decided the object needed a name. Not an official one, of course, just a suggestion to throw against the wall. And unfortunately, Marcy chose the single, absolute, best name for that particular planet that any mortal could ever conceive. Bellerophon, the man who rode Pegasus to Olympus and was struck out of the air by Zeus. How perfect for a planet in the Pegasus constellation that likely migrated too close to its star and is now on a slow path to destruction as stellar wind gradually tears it apart. Could there be a more precise fit for any planet? No. No, there could not. Of course, that would be the planet's name in the fullness of time. But then Marcy took a gun to posterity and shot it in the face. The IAU vote happened to coincide with a rush of multiple accusations of sexual harassment and illicit groping against Marcy, stretching across 4 years, in a report totaling, frankly staggering, 120 pages. By the time the vote was launched, Marcy was already in not really voluntary retirement, and his name for 51 Pegasi b wasn't even listed among the possibilities. All I can say in response to that nightmare is this. One day, Geoffrey Marcy will die. Doubtless, history will do its damnedest to forget him, likely blurring his achievements into those of Michel Mayor, who remains the first person to have found an exoplanet around a sun-like star. Within a century, Marcy's life will shrink to a picky trivia question, and when that happens, and he and his legacy are forgotten, perhaps then Bellerophon might be reconsidered. 8. The Groombridges. Given that our 100 or so nearest stars have been mostly named by modern scientists, they have, on the whole, managed to garner a rather passable collection of monikers. There are the classical holdouts, of course, like Sirius and Procyon, but even the modern ones are quite nice. Some are mildly euphonious, like Alpha Centauri or Epsilon Eridani. Some are stately and reserved, like Barnard Star or 61 Cygni. And some are quirky and cool, like Easy Aquarii or Wolf 359. Granted, there are the occasional serial numbers, mainly brown dwarfs, but should future colonists find their way into these systems, I doubt there will be many calls to change names, with a few glaring exceptions. I have nothing against the talented, dedicated amateur astronomer Stephen Groombridge, whose catalogue of circumpolar stars, published posthumously in 1838, granted his name to 3 of our closest neighbors, Groombridge 34, Groombridge 1618, and Groombridge 1830. He worked at that catalogue for 20 years, 10 making observations, 10 collating the data, even after a likely stroke left him partially paralyzed. He died before completing his magnum opus, which was finally published by the Astronomer Royal, George Biddle Airy, one of the few compassionate things that peculiar man ever did. But I have to wonder, did Groombridge, throughout his life, not tire of the slight pause that must have accompanied every mention of his name? How often did he wait for that additional split second as his acquaintances gathered their tongues to navigate that cataract of consonants? "So sorry to hear of your illness, Mr. Groombridge. Congratulations on your marriage, Mr. Groombridge." If and when these stars ever become more important to our lives, that momentary stop will become endemic. Someday, there may even be humans living in orbit around these stars. What should we call them then? Groomers? Groombridge deserves his memorial, so I'm willing to keep one for his edification. Let it be 1618, which has no alternate names. 34 is a binary comprising 2 red dwarfs called GX Andromedae and GQ Andromedae. So why not call the pair G Andromedae? And thanks to the man who determined its markedly fast proper motion, 1830 already has an awesome alternate name, Argelander's star. In fact, our neighboring few parsecs are littered with awesome names of various astronomers, most of which are unofficial. Get on that, IAU. 7. The Laniakea Supercluster. Let me be clear, my issue is not with the name Laniakea. In fact, I've grown quite enamored of this recent trend of granting celestial objects Polynesian names, in honor of the growing citadel atop Mauna Kea that has granted us so many discoveries. With Latin and Greek fast growing stale, the beautiful round vowels of Hawaiian make a potent substitute. No. My issue is with the word supercluster. To explain, assuming you are a human being, you are located within the inhabited quarter of the surface of the Earth, a small to mid-sized terrestrial planet orbiting roughly 150 million kilometers from the Sun. A medium-sized yellow star currently wending its way through the Orion Spur, a small offshoot of one of the 4 spiral arms of a largish galaxy, the Milky Way. The Milky Way is in turn orbited by a number of small galaxies, and together they are in a collision course with Andromeda, a larger galaxy currently 2 million light-years away, trailing its own armada of satellite galaxies. This slow-motion cosmic car crash, called the Local Group, is located about 2/3 of the way from the center of the Virgo supercluster, a loose, chaotic assemblage of about 10,000 galaxies in gravitational thrall to the Virgo cluster, a dense group of 1,500 or so galaxies about 50 million light-years away, and home to M87, the mega-galaxy whose central black hole we snapped in 2019. And for a while, that's where it stopped. Planet, star system, galaxy, cluster, supercluster. Nice, quiet, and parochial. Attempts to see the ladder's next rung, assuming it had one, were hampered by the fact that while it was possible to tell the distance between galaxies, it was far harder to see if they were gravitationally bound. And then, in 2014, a team of astronomers from around the world, led by R. Brent Tully at the University of Hawaii, realized that location meant nothing. What mattered was movement. If you could plot the motion and direction of every galaxy within, say, the nearest billion light-years, you could map the flow to determine which galaxies were in common motion with each other. It's a bit like the African Great Lakes. You can see them as a single group, or you can see them as parts of different river basins. In fact, the river analogy was so potent, it was how the idea of this new structure was sold to the public. As a great, three-dimensional river basin comprising 100,000 galaxies and 100 quadrillion stars. The team named this basin Laniakea, Hawaiian for immense heaven, on the suggestion of Nawa'a Napoleon, a professor of Hawaiian language at Kapiolani Community College. River basins on Earth all follow the quickest route to the source of gravity, i.e. Earth's center. Galactic basins, like Laniakea, flow towards the greatest nearby center of gravity. In Laniakea's case, a mysterious structure known simply as the Great Attractor. The Great Attractor has actually been known since the 1970s, but to date, no one knows precisely what it is because its line of sight lies within the plane of the Milky Way, where the stars blot out any background objects. Whatever it is, it must be pretty big. If you've been following this, and apologies if you found that difficult, you may have noticed that our local group is contained within the Virgo supercluster, which is in turn part of the Laniakea supercluster. You see the problem? Laniakea is not a supercluster. It's a cluster of superclusters. The scope for confusion is wide with this one. I can tell you just from researching it that it's already caused havoc on Wikipedia. If Laniakea is a supercluster, does that mean the Virgo supercluster is not? If not, what is it? Or should Laniakea have a higher designation? Prior usage with stars would suggest hypercluster, though I think galactic basin is more descriptive. Astronomers have a habit of leaving language in a wreck wherever they go. Maybe it's time we told them to clean their room. 6. Milkomeda. And speaking of our galaxy's impending collision with Andromeda, that is expected to happen right around the time our star begins its slow transition off the main sequence and its long journey toward becoming a red giant. Life on Earth is unlikely to survive long enough to see it, though if it does, it's in for a fantastic view. The distances between stars are so vast that the mere collision with a trillion solar mass galaxy is unlikely to result in any planets being kicked from their orbits, though the solar system itself might be kicked into the galactic halo. The gravitational pull of each galaxy will likely tug at the spare hydrogen floating around each of them, causing it to condense into a final burst of new star formation, known, aptly, as a starburst. After which, the galaxy will settle into a quiet retirement, as young blue stars fade and older red stars proliferate. The mashing together of these two galaxies will destroy their beautiful spiral structure, reducing it to a simple blob called an elliptical galaxy. Until recently, no one had really contemplated what this monster combined galaxy should be called. And then, in 2008, T.J. Cox and Avi Loeb, a pair of astronomers working for the Smithsonian, ran a series of simulations to produce the most likely outcome, which they dubbed Milkomeda, because it was a combination of the Milky Way and Andromeda. Now, I'm a big fan of Avi Loeb. He seems like a great guy, an astronomer after my own heart, and always willing to look for dragons. He's been a fearless advocate for the possibility that Oumuamua is an alien spacecraft, for instance. But Milkomeda?
Hey, you guys, what's the name of the new company going to be? Moland Spring.
Moland?
Yes, we combined Morgan and Poland.
Yeah, I know, but Moland? I wouldn't drink anything called Moland.
Loeb chose the name apparently after ensuring it had no offensive connotations, which is nice, I suppose. But Milkomeda, aside from being awkward to say, is remarkably Anglo-centric. A fact I find doubly curious because English is not Dr. Loeb's first language. There's a reason so many of the stellar names from the Renaissance are in Latin. Latin was a language of no country, and thus could be for all countries. English may be the lingua franca of today, but it is still very much of its place. As an alternative, might I suggest a return to Latin? The Latin name of the Milky Way was the Via Lactea. Perhaps Andromeda Lactea would be suitable? Again, no disrespect to Dr. Loeb. I offer merely the fruits of my meager wisdom. 5. The Scutum-Centaurus Arm. I'll be honest, this one's only on here because of Scutum. Yes, it's a constellation. One of those boring southern ones invented by modern scientists instead of mythopoeists. But that doesn't make it a word I want to say. There are just too many disgusting words that are one letter or syllable away from scutum for me to accept it as just the Latin name for shield. So why am I not complaining about the constellation instead? Well, it's been around since 1684 and is too embedded into astronomical nomenclature to change now. Our galactic arms, however, are changing all the time. Because we're in it, no one has so far managed to precisely nail down the structure of our galaxy, with recent years seeing models shift between this one, with its 4 long, thick, protuberant spiral arms, and this one, with its more elegant Georgia O'Keeffe-style structure. Currently, the former model appears to be in the ascendant. We apparently live in a proud galaxy. Each of our galaxy's 4 spiral arms is named for a constellation in which it resides when viewed from Earth. In inward-outward order, they are the Carina Sagittarius Arm, the Perseus Arm, where we are, the Norma Arm, and the Scutum-Centaurus Arm. In Star Trek terms, the Sagittarius Arm is located in the Beta and Delta quadrants, the Perseus and Norma arms are located mainly in the Alpha and Gamma quadrants, while the outer, sweeping Scutum Arm encompasses all 4 quadrants. As such, would it not make more sense to call the Carina and Scutum arms the inner and outer arms? It took astronomers decades to determine where these arms were. Their constellational location is of no use to anyone not willing to spend decades doing the same. Inner and outer at least offer concise descriptions for the non-astronomer. Obviously, the middle two will need distinguishing names of their own, but for now, since I am unschooled in the finer points of galactic cartography, I will let them keep their constellations. 4. Buffy. This isn't about the nickname. If Mike Brown could call Eris Xena, then Lynn Allen can name her TNO after a snarky 90s TV superheroine. But Buffy, or 2004 XR190 to be pedantic, was discovered 16 years ago. The joke isn't funny anymore, and Buffy is simply too fascinating an object not to have a proper name. At between 500 and 600 kilometers across, Buffy lies in the gray zone between probable and improbable dwarf planethood. As it has no moon to measure its mass, and no spectra have been obtained from it, very little is known about its physical composition. So what, you might well argue, makes this object so fascinating? Well, the same thing keeping it from getting a name: its orbit. Like Sedna and the retrospectively prematurely nicknamed Biden, Buffy is a detached object, a trans-Neptunian object with an orbit too far from the planets to have been scattered to its current position. To this day, we still do not understand what forces pulled Buffy and her fellow detached objects into their current positions, and their existence is one of the main arguments for the elusive Planet 9. But even for a detached object, Buffy is unique. Sedna and Biden, despite being beyond the influence of the planets, have vast, insanely elongated orbits, stretching for hundreds of AU. Buffy's orbit, somehow, is nearly circular. In fact, with an eccentricity of just 0.1, Buffy's orbit is almost as circular as Mars's. It gets weirder, though, when you look at its side on. Buffy's orbit lies at a near-perfect 45-degree angle to the ecliptic. It's enough to make you believe in trickster gods. Buffy and its small population of low-eccentricity detached objects are the only TNOs found within the so-called Kuiper gap between the scattered objects and the farthest detached objects, now rather nauseatingly called sednoids. Buffy, in short, is one of the most fascinating objects ever observed in the solar system. So why doesn't it have a name? In keeping with Mike Brown's suggestion after naming Sedna, Lynn Allen and her team submitted several names of Arctic and Inuit origin to the IAU for consideration, soon after discovery. According to IAU rules, a name can only be given to an object after it obtains a minor planet number, and a minor planet number can only be given after its orbit has been secured with 4 well-observed oppositions. Oppositions with KBOs occur once every Earth year. We've had 16. The kid from Logan was born after Buffy was discovered. And do you know when Buffy's last IAU recorded observation was? 2017. That's 4 oppositions ago. If Sedna's orbit, which is much longer, could be secured so soon after its discovery, why not Buffy's far closer and less eccentric orbit? Is it the nickname? 3. Sagittarius A star. Okay. This one. I have discussed this one before, and indeed it formed part of the inspiration for this video. I do not wish to lessen the achievement of Bruce Ballack and Robert Brown, who first identified the aforementioned object in 1974. I can, however, remain supremely peeved at Brown's choice of name for it. For those who don't know, Sagittarius A*, pronounced Sagittarius A star because we apparently must come to its rescue, is the supermassive black hole at the center of our galaxy, the focal point around which our galaxy revolves, a beacon of mystery, wonder, and ancient power, a dark satanic mill churning the substance of creation. And it's called Sagittarius A. Part of the name is accidental. Sagittarius A originally referred to the immense radio source emanating from the magnetic field spinning around the black hole. Upon discovering the black hole, Brown declared it Sagittarius A*, because asterisks are used to denote atoms in an excited state, and the discovery was exciting. Look, I am not a scientist. As you can probably tell, I was shunted off the line to Digitopolis pretty early and sent straight to the Dictionopolis word mines. I get that those who stayed on the train to the terminus might not be as versed as I am in the more verbal or mythical sides of the human experience, but, and I ask this of the numerically inclined in genuine perplexity, when was the last time you read a book for enjoyment? How can you envision an ebon engine of primordial creation and destruction spinning its threads of plasma into the surrounding void, and call it Sgr A? Aside from anything else, a supermassive black hole is a pretty important location in the galaxy. Could you imagine a map of the UK in which London was identified solely by its latitude and longitude? And worse, it's begun to infect other galaxies as well. The black hole at the center of M87, imaged in 2019, is now called M87. Should we not then start calling our black hole Milky Way? Personally, given its role as the primordial darkness at the heart of our galaxy, I can think of no better name for than Erebus, personification of darkness in Greek mythology, and firstborn of the primordial chaos. I know it won't be taken up, but I offer it as an illustration of what a short trip on the other line can offer. 2. Proxima Centauri. Astronomical projects don't often make historical statements. They typically limit their assertions to the hypotheses to be tested and the conclusions to be drawn. Not so the Pale Red Dot Project. Launched in 2016 specifically to locate a planet around our nearest star, it achieved its goal in just 4 months. Unveiling their new planet to the world, they declared it as Proxima b. Except our nearest star is called Proxima Centauri, not Proxima. In so naming their world, the Pale Red Dot Initiative had taken sides in a dispute I doubt anyone knew existed. Why decide to summarily rename a star that had been comfortably titled for over a century? Pale Red Dot's decision was confusing, finicky, and potentially antagonizing. It was also right. Proxima Centauri means nearest of the Centaur, a name chosen by the star's discoverer, the Scots-Australian astronomer Robert Innes, 2 years after discovering it in 1915. Robert Innes was of the same hard-scrabble generation of astronomers typified by Edward Barnard, though Innes' life was nowhere near as Dickensian as Barnard's had been. Like Barnard, he was never professionally trained as an astronomer, but rose through the ranks on the back of massive dedication and exceptional eyesight. Like many people from a frontier culture, he was a strident individualist and refused to wear a tie. After a moderately successful stint at that most genteel of Australian careers, winemaking, Innes emigrated to South Africa, hoping to secure a professional astronomical position, and got one at the Royal Observatory on the Cape of Good Hope. While there, he discovered another nearby star, now called Captine Star because no one is ever named for stars they discover. In 1903, he became the director of the Union Observatory in Transvaal. It was there that he noticed a tiny star with a high proper motion that seemed tied to the double star system Alpha Centauri, then the closest known stars to the Sun. Despite being one of the most prominent stars in our sky, and visible to the ancients, Alpha Centauri remains the most famous star, actually stars, but that wasn't until later, still only known by its Bayer designation, a stellar classification system devised in 1603 by the German astronomer Johann Bayer that employs a Greek letter followed by a Latin genitive of the star's constellation. The system orders stars in order of brightness, so for instance, the brightest star in the constellation of Lyra is called Alpha Lyrae, while the third brightest star in the constellation of Orion is called Gamma Orionis. Alpha Centauri is thus the brightest star in the constellation Centaurus. In his decision to name his new star Proxima Centauri was, at the time, one of commendable caution. By naming it only the nearest of the Centaur, rather than the nearest full stop, he was leaving the door open for any future stars that might be found closer to our Sun. But in the more than 100 years since, that has not happened. And in the post-Gaia world, the idea that any stars might be found nearer to our Sun than Proxima Centauri, at least into our galaxy's motion brings them to us in about 11,000 years, is fantastical. Proxima Centauri is not merely the Proxima of Centaurus. It is Proxima, our nearest star. Let it be so. 1. Uranus. Look, of course this had to be number 1. I suppose I could pull a bait and switch, but come on. We all knew this was coming. And I do have a very serious bone to pick about this name, though not for the reason you might think. I've never been precisely clear on how Uranus got its name. I mean, yes, I know who coined it and why. In fact, the story is relatively well attested. As followers of my channel will know, Uranus was discovered in 1781 by my favorite astronomer, William Herschel. Once convinced that what he'd found was in fact a planet, as how could he be expected to think he'd done something that, until his time, literally no one in recorded history had ever done, he was asked, very graciously I might add, by the then British Astronomer Royal Neville Maskelyne, to do both his and our world the honor of naming it. And Herschel, ever a loyal subject of the crown, chose Georgium Sidus, or the Star of George, in honor of his sovereign and patron, George III. Which goes to show that you should never ask the opinion of anyone whose entire livelihood depends on someone else. The name Georgium was popular in the UK for decades, but it never traveled well. Jérôme Lalande, the great French astronomer who would, only a few years later, unknowingly spot Neptune, suggested Herschel for the name of the planet, while others suggested the retroactively prescient name Neptune. The man who finally brought the gavel down was Johann Elert Bode, the German astronomer who, as editor of the Berliner Astronomical Almanac, was seen as something of a storehouse of astronomical wisdom. In his paper, From the Newly Discovered Planet, he declared that any modern name would stand out like a sore thumb, and that the new planet have a classical name alongside the others of the solar system. To that end, he suggested Uranus, the sky, father of Saturn, who was in turn father of Jupiter, who was father of Mars. Clear and logical. Very German. And here is where my problem with Bode's choice lies. Uranus is a Greek name. Yes, all of the planets originally did have Greek names, but thanks to the ubiquity of Latin for 2,000 years, we know them by their Roman names. And there is a Roman equivalent to Uranus, Kailos, a nice, simple word that could never be made into an obscenity. And don't tell me Bode didn't know this. If a 12-year-old girl could give a planet a Roman name, then a classically educated man of the Enlightenment certainly could. Why did Bode make this mistake? I can't say I know, but I do have an idea. The rise of humanism during the Renaissance had led to a rediscovery, and perhaps something of an idolization, of Greek language and knowledge. Notice how all of the planets known since antiquity have Roman names, but the moons, all save our own discovered since 1610, have Greek names. I doubt it even occurred to Bode to use Latin instead of Greek, and as someone who has studied both Latin and Greek in college, that's a bias I share. Greek is by far the better language. But still, Bode's decision left a blemish in the cosmic order that has never been repaired. It's time to make our solar system whole again.